to justify as benevolent the actions of continuous social control. And you see this in the structure of the Obama campaign in 2012. You see this in the structure of advertising. You see this essentially becoming a standard solution set, which is a fundamentally different challenge to efficiency in markets, because what on earth is efficiency? When I choose something because you do something to me that you've experimented will make me want it. A fundamental challenge to the idea of freedom in markets, because what on earth does freedom mean if I am so predictable at the end of the day that you can manipulate the framework to get me to work? And therefore fundamentally different than the challenge of neoliberalism. I think at the moment the most powerful idea we stand for is the social embeddedness of production and the creepiness of being, I'm just going to have to steal from you, programmable. That was very good. That challenge, what we have, is the basis on which to claim that when you disembed markets from society, you lose both productivity and freedom as a core working world. And what the alternative models of sustainable capitalism are that integrate commons and market and state, that don't rely on this form of rent extraction, that seems to me to be a challenge that I don't quite know how we connect from here to there with our work, but that we all have to keep in mind as one of the things we need to resist. Thank you.
Is this mic working?
Yes.
Okay.
It was just the switch.
Okay, just the switch. I wondered if you could address your take on Aaron Swartz and Eric Holder's Justice Department in your backyard in Boston vis-a-vis prosecutor Miss Ortiz wanting 30 years in prison for Aaron Swartz. I wondered if you could share your thoughts and the justice of that case and Aaron's subsequent suicide facing 30 years in prison.
I think it was a travesty and a tragedy, as I've said publicly. Let me take that to a somewhat broader answer. There are multiple dimensions of that. The first is the criminalization of copyright and the criminalization of computer-based activism. Essentially, you have forms of activism that, in a different universe, would be at most misdemeanors, generally speaking tolerated, covered with a veneer of hackerism and the rhetoric of cyber attack, cyber threat, that create situations where a sit-in is a 10-year, the equivalent of a sit-in is a 10-year felony in prison. You couple that with the much broader American attitude toward punishment and prosecution, where what my late colleague described as the assembly line prosecution, assembly line criminal justice system, creates a deep threat of suppressing a massive amount of the population, whether it's specifically on copyright or computer crime or more generally. It's harder for me to say more than that.
Very interesting and stimulating talk and lots of great points. Since my question at the end, you did come out and mention alternative, post-capitalist futures and so on. And the question of how to devote adequate time to doing that kind of work of envisioning and even trying to create what can be alternatives, as opposed to the temptations and, in a sense, the easy work, which may feel very necessary work, of all the critique of all the injustice and things that are wrong, but so easy to get trapped in that. And book after book, 80, 90% of it is the analysis and the critique and what's wrong, and then you get a little bit at the end that may be something else. And I keep wishing, are there ways to flip that around on the one hand, and on the second side, Sun Tzu, Art of War, talks about always leave room for your enemy to become your friend. That how to not get trapped as just a debate in attacking neoliberalism, and instead finding the common ground, that there are actually a lot of shared aspirations. There's a whole bunch of stuff in Hayek, which a lot of the people who think they're using them are not particularly aware of, that reflects very important ideas and virtues. And are there ways or frameworks for creating and trying to live counter narratives, envisioning and trying to bring about the possible? Thank you.
So for the first question, when you find the answer, let me know. All I can say is I sometimes feel like the little Dutch boy running from one hole in the wall, one crack in the wall, and the first thing that demands our attention, and the answer is some form of discipline, and actually something like this, that structuring is important. To the question of not proposing this as a continuous opposition, I agree and I disagree. So I agree in the sense that, yes, understanding the theoretical framework that allows bridging the divide is critically important. I think, for example, the first place I presented on Spectrum Commons in DC in around 2000 or so was the Cato Institute. And the Cato Institute, there's a really dividing line within the libertarians between those who see spectrum property really just as regulation and those who see it really just as property. And that's a place where there's a strong alliance. Just like there is, although not quite as strong, as there is a strong alliance between libertarians and commons people on copyright policy and on patent policy. Where again, SOPA PIPA, very clearly left-right divide, very clearly left-right bridging. And so in that regard, there are these domains where some of these ideas play out. I think once we get to a better understanding of the similarities between firms and the state, large firms and the state, and the similarities between choice in society and choice in markets, and we refine those, that will give us much more of a common ground with libertarians. It's not going to give us common ground with people who are centralized institutionalists, whether they're progressive or conservative, because there's the dramatic, polycentricity depends on an idea of decentralized power and is not necessarily convenient for people who want solutions at the state level either. So it's not so much a left-right, but these are places where I'm beginning to see the bridging.
So I just have a little question. So one of the things, thinking about the conventional model that we're rebelling against in a sense, or sort of fighting against, in terms of rationality, one of the things that's is sort of, there's other features, right? For example, that preferences are stable and fixed, right? So it ties to where you get to later, that are very tricky, but we don't, at least in our studies or when we're thinking about knowledge commons, we don't necessarily get into those types of questions, and I'm not even sure how we would go about it, although I think it's important that we do. I'm just wondering if you have suggestions along those lines. And then the second is trying to think about the relationships between not just human beings in terms of their motivations for what they do, but human beings and the resources themselves, right? So in other words, how information, knowledge, or even if we're talking about other things like the other resources affect how people behave and what they're capable of doing, which is again something that we try to at times get into it when we're doing these case studies and we're thinking about it, but again, it's a very tricky question, and I'm not even sure what's the discipline that actually focuses on that question, the relationship between information, resources, information, and humans and how we behave and how we act.
So I see Kathy is sort of worried about the time. No?
What we're going to do is we're just going to shift. We have extra. We have leeway lunch break. So we're just going to shift the the sessions forward 15 minutes. So we're
Okay.
fine. And this will probably should be the last session.
Charlie's.
Oh, okay. Let's.
No, this is actually, motivations over time, stability. A study design, so for example, one of the things that's really worthwhile trying to do is finding measures of motivational profiles and testing people over time. So one of the things that, one method, not all, something that a paper that Jan Algan and Jérôme Hergeau and I and Mayo Fuster had basically took 850 Wikipedians of varying degrees of experience and ran them through a standard battery of cooperation games to see the relationship between behavior in the lab as more or less reciprocity-based, more or less trusting, more or less altruistic, and their contributions to Wikipedia. Very interesting work, static still. But then the question is taking the same approach and looking at people right when they're newbies, after a year, etc. Same thing can be done with any volunteer organization. You come in, you know, something that would be wonderful to do. You go into a class of people who go to Volunteer for America or whatever it is. You take the class of applicants, you run them through a battery. Then you take those who succeeded and those who didn't succeed, and a year later, you run them through again. And you see, given that their baseline preferences, you do that. You follow people, experiment. So that's a class of studies that we need to do, but that's well within our range of empirical methods. The second thing, the conceptual thing, so there's a piece I did with Helen Nissenbaum in 2006 on peer production and virtue that was trying to begin to get at that question, right? It's a model of virtue as habit, essentially as self-consciously chosen practices that embody a set of ethical commitments that shift from being an act of discipline to being second nature through habit over time. And I think the question there becomes, it's related to your question about the resources, but it's less about the resource and more about the practice. And so it's a work of trying to theoretically embed the idea, why on earth would somebody who's volunteered for 5 years be more pro-social than they were when they came in? Or will they or won't they? Or why on earth would somebody who was pro-social coming into a fiercely competitive environment stop being pro-social? That's the question of the relationship between habit and virtue.
So just really quickly, I've been wondering about the challenge of commons-based peer production systems and the question of making a living wage. And I'm wondering if you've got cases that come to your mind that you think should be studied, that you think might be getting that right.
You mean living wage, or do you mean living wage? Do you mean basic income? Do you mean how do we keep body and soul together?
Take it whichever way you want to take it.
So let's see, how do I dodge this one?
Sorry.
No. First of all, it is, if not the most important, an absolutely critical question we need to answer if we're going to be in conversation on the future of capitalism. Because at the end of the day, people need to keep body and soul together. So I can imagine a situation where what you do is you go to a country with a very, very, very comfortable social safety net or a basic income, and you look at levels of participation. At which point the answer becomes, it's not self-sustaining, it's a way of creating productivity in a society that separates meaningful work and society scale productivity from remunerated work. That's one class of things we can do and look at. Free software is a place that's very easy in some sense to look at because so many people who contribute earn better than a living wage, but I worry that it's unique. So in that regard, yes, there are distinct initial ways to go after that, but that comes back to the question of scaling that I raised as sort of a major question, right? What works in free software because so much of the revenue from software is software services, and so many software services firms are one or two people, essentially single people doing it. So you can, the shape of the market and the level of skill is such that it's feasible. Whether the same is feasible in other forms, it's certainly not the case that I've seen in a substantial way for Wikipedia, and I don't know that it is from any other areas. But that's, to me, more of a call for investigation and basically to say, how do people make a living? So model one, that's one way in which you integrate the state. The state basically is interested in social productivity. Back to Frank's point about how you measure productivity. There he is. How you measure productivity from free software when it's not about remuneration. So you do more work like that to say it is not a mistake for a country to understand that if it has 10,000 people producing a Wikipedia in their language, that's not zero productivity. That's really both direct productivity and follow-on productivity. And so when a country needs to support productivity through the market, it does all sorts of things one way or the other. If it needs to support productivity through the non-market, it needs to do it otherwise. But that means you're separating productivity from price, and therefore you need to separate productive work from remunerated work. That's one class of answers, and I suspect that the best place to start looking at that is places that have implemented some form of universal basic income or a very good, right, what's the level of peer production activity in Sweden? I don't know, but it would be really interesting to see if it's substantially different from other places. And then the second line, looking at free software to look at the modalities in which people make money, and then seeing to what extent it's replicable in other areas. That to me is one of the most important or immediately important domains for doing the study of scaling and scoping.
Hola, welcome to the internet. And our community because of the
que permite eliminar las divisiones analíticos como base en algunos ejemplos prácticas y colectivos y la colectivización en América Latina. Él propone un marco analítico que integra la investigación de bienes comunes con el fin de generar espacios y sinergias entre diferentes tradiciones e investigaciones en la región. Con eso voy a pasar la voz de Dr. Castro para que él pueda hacer su presentación. Bienvenido, Fabio.
Gracias, Peter. Bueno, antes gustaría de agradecer a Peter por la invitación. Es un gusto estar aquí para compartir un poco de mis reflexiones sobre las cuestiones de los comunes. También quería agradecer a Charlie que ha organizado este evento. A todos ustedes que en un sábado que están aquí en esta charla. Bueno, como Peter ha dicho ahora, a poquito, un tiempo, que yo voy a hablar un poco refletir un poco sobre una cuestión que siempre me ha llamado la atención, de que nosotros que trabajamos en Latinoamérica estamos involucrados en la discusión sobre los comunes. percibimos que hay la participación latinoamericana es un poco más baja que de otras regiones, pero la cuestión es sobre los comunes está por todas las partes de Latinoamérica. Entonces, la pregunta central es ¿por qué? ¿No? ¿Por qué que nosotros no hay una involucración más fuerte de los investigadores latinoamericanos que trabajan en este tema, que muchas veces están utilizando otros conceptos, otros están en otros debates, pero no están se involucrando en debates de los recursos comunes. Entonces, es más una reflexión que más que nada y quizás unas ideas de cómo podemos hacer tener un poco más de integración, más de conexión con la literatura de otros debates teóricos, ¿no? Entonces, mi presentación hoy está dividida en 4 temas, ¿no? El primer tema es para un poco la introducción de los conceptos de los bienes comunes, un poco para comprender de dónde estoy refletiendo, sobre qué estoy refletiendo, la forma de pensar en los recursos comunes. Después hablar un poco de la perspectiva latinoamericana, el contexto, quizás más contexto latinoamericano de investigación sobre estos temas. Y después quiero contar a ustedes un poco de un experimento que nosotros en la Universidad de Ámsterdam, en Cedar, de donde trabajo, hicimos un experimento de cómo tratar el tema de los comunes en varios aspectos de transformaciones sociales. Y al final, encerrar con una idea, quizás una idea general sobre dónde podemos ir, ¿no? De cómo podemos involucrar más distintos intereses o perspectivas para congregar un diálogo más fuerte entre varias disciplinas. Bueno, entonces empezando con el primer tema, bueno, este es un libro que muchos de nosotros tenemos conocimiento, ¿no? Es un libro que ha marcado ¿cómo se dice? Conceptualización teórica de los comunes, que estaba muy conectada con estudios en áreas rurales, recursos naturales renovables, y con el dilema, ¿no? que Ostrom estaba tratando, que es la cuestión de esos recursos que tiene los problemas que se quedan escasos, si la utilización es muy fuerte, pero y al mismo tiempo es muy difícil la exclusión de personas, pero en la verdad es difícil, pero no es imposible. Entonces, con varios estudios, con una carga muy grande de datos empíricos, Ostrom ha estudiado y llegado a conclusiones de que factores institucionales de organizaciones que ha tratado las personas ha conseguido pasar, ¿no? Resolver los problemas de estos dilemas. Y después, al final, hay una propuesta de aspectos, ¿no? Diseños institucionales que facilitan, que explican estas soluciones. Esta perspectiva de los comunes sigue hasta hoy, está muy bien desarrollada y sigue con análisis de recursos naturales, pero al final de hace 10, 15 años ha empezado también una otra mirada también de los comunes que tiene a ver con los nuevos comunes, ¿no? Entonces, allá de los espacios rurales y recursos naturales, pero también recursos públicos, urbanos, espacios urbanos y también virtuales, y más una mirada no tratando los recursos comunes como algo predefinido que está definido como dificultad de exclusión y posibilidad de escasez, pero mucho más en función de una producción colectiva, ¿no? En función de una construcción social. Entonces, esta perspectiva ha añadido otros aspectos también de colectividad que tienen a ver con aspectos políticos y culturales. ¿no? Y tiene mucho a ver también con luchas, ideas de contrahegemónica y de contestación. Esto también viene de un contexto urbano muy fuerte, ¿no? De una privatización muy excesiva, la individualización de las actividades urbanas y toda una forma de reapropiación de los espacios urbanos por colectivos, ¿no? Por grupos en las ciudades, casi que una idea del derecho a la ciudad. Entonces, esta perspectiva ha de una forma no creado un reto, pero ha creado unas preguntas a más de cómo podemos desarrollar el concepto de una forma más amplia. Pero más recientemente ha ido un poco más lejos, ¿no? Con esta idea que ha tenido una perspectiva casi que de activismo, ¿no? Que estos libros solamente ideas de libros que representan esas perspectivas, ¿no? Y este es un libro más reciente que ha sido publicado año pasado, me parece, y tiene todo un lenguaje y toda una forma de conceptualización de los comunes como una nueva ola contrahegemónica, ¿no? De pensar con una conceptualización de transformación social y donde la movilización política es un punto central, ¿no? Y de imaginación radical, ¿no? De movimientos sociales. Entonces, desde una perspectiva más teórica, una perspectiva más bien definida en términos de conceptos para determinados sistemas de análisis muy claro, ha cambiado un poco para casi que una forma de un activismo, pero los tres tienen en común el término común, los comunes, ¿no? Entonces es interesante de ver cómo los comunes ha tratado de un punto de vista más socioecológico para un punto de vista de movimiento social y dentro de una perspectiva de cambio para construcción social. Estas tres perspectivas, si pensamos en Latinoamérica, está por todas las partes. Todos nosotros que trabajamos de una forma en Latinoamérica, en procesos sociales, socioambientales, culturales, tenemos siempre en cuenta un poco de estos temas. Estos temas están ahí, construcción social, temas de exclusión, temas o dificultad de exclusión, contestación, eso está todo ahí, pero el tema, cuando hablamos en términos de publicación, lo que vimos es una participación de Latinoamérica no muy alta, ¿no? Esta gráfica, no es África, tengo que, perdón, está arriba, es América del Sur, por alguna razón no está formatado bien. Pero la atención que quería para que ustedes tengan es de América Central y Sur. Cuando vemos, tenemos dos barras, ¿no? Uno que es más en naranja, que es la participación, las publicaciones de estudios en Latinoamérica, que es más alta, un poco en relación al otro, pero todavía sigue más bajo entre las otras regiones. Aquí está África, Europa y Asia. Pero cuando vemos en azul, es los investigadores que hacen la investigación en Latinoamérica. Y ahí se baja mucho, ¿no? Entonces, lo que pasa es que los estudios que tienen, que no son tantos, los que hay son llevados a cabo por instituciones extranjeras. Entonces, esto también me llama la atención porque los investigadores latinoamericanos tienen un poco, están lejos del debate de los comunes, están muy conectados con debates políticos, debates de cuestiones culturales y todo eso que tiene a ver con los comunes, pero el término, el abordaje de los comunes no está ahí. Entonces, estos son dos puntos que esta gráfica es interesante. Y también otro punto que está, pero no está ahí, pero está en el artículo que fue publicado este año, que el foco en Latinoamérica todavía sigue en recursos naturales. Pero quando pensamos que Latinoamérica também é um espaço muito urbanizado, não? Latinoamérica, muitos países são muito mais urbanizados, porcentagem muito grande, e muitos problemas de descomunização ou comunização, não? De coletivação em espaços urbanos, também chama a atenção que não há tantas discussões em processos urbanos com o contexto de debate de los comunes. E, ao final, outro ponto que é interessante é que as publicações em espanhol e em português, de alguma forma, não estão muito visíveis, não? Porque aqui, esta análise é somente de várias revistas internacionais, mas não estão as revistas latino-americanas. Quando eu he hecho muy rápidamente, muy sencilla, una revisión del cielo, que es, en la verdad, también es un espacio abierto, entonces es interesante que tiene a ver también con los comunes virtuales, ¿no? Que la academia están publicando ahí en espacios abiertos. Yo he hecho una revisión muy rápida y he encontrado desde 2012 a 2019 30 artículos que tienen a ver con cuestiones de recursos comunes. E me chamou a atenção é que há muito não, pero metade dos artículos não tem a ver com recursos naturais. Tem a ver com saúde pública, tem a ver com educação, tem a ver com espaços urbanos também. Então, este é muito interessante de ver que há uma literatura, há grupo interessado, pero estão todavía publicando em Latinoamérica e a comunidade internacional todavía não está conectada com essa literatura. Então, a questão de idioma é ponto também para que chama a atenção. Pero seguimos para entonces el segundo tema, ¿no? Porque, ¿cómo está el contexto de Latinoamérica? Si en Latinoamérica está más difícil, entonces, ¿por qué que no hay tanta conexión con eso, ¿no? Entonces, cuando seguimos la historia de Latinoamérica, o punto central de los comunes, muy, muy discutido en varias literaturas en Latinoamérica, es o acaparamiento de los comunes, ¿no? Entonces, é uma história de despojo, é uma história de despojo territorial, de despojo epistêmico, não? De despojo de identidade, não? As pessoas vão... há uma história de colonização, de transformações culturais, também de juegos de poder, uma estrutura de poder muito forte, onde as instituições também que se formam formaron instituciones más frágiles, ¿no? Quizás no frágiles porque son vulnerables en algunos aspectos, pero muchas instituciones informales estructuradas en relación de poder son muy fuertes. Pero las instituciones más formales, quizás de derechos, también siguen al revés, que tienen algunos retos, ¿no? Para que se implementen de forma más concreta. Entonces, hay una cuestión de desigualdad. El conflicto es siempre un punto central en las análisis de los comunes. Esto es un poco distinto de las análisis de sistemas socioecológicos,
He's more than 11 games under his belt, including casual hit Regency Solitaire.
I mean, you know as well as I, the game industry is very fast moving. Um, that's one thing. And also, I've had to a certain extent, control my risks because I've got a family and so on. I haven't really, and I haven't had a large amount of money backing me up. So I've had to sort of take careful, make careful decisions as I've gone forward. So I haven't really sort of been able to sort of plow years into some kind of passion project with the hope that it will come out and be a huge hit. And unfortunately, what happens to many people who do that is it's not a success and then they're out of the business, right? So I've just sort of trod carefully, learned as I went along, made good contacts, been flexible in my approach, sort of improved my approach to running a business and making games. There's many small sort of decisions along the way. So it's not really a sort of magic formula. It's just something that has worked out for me as I've gone along, you know.
Initially, how do you sort of choose the niche that you're going to work in? Do you have particular favorite niches and do you research into them?
The reason I for most of my sort of career have made what are called casual games. Now, when people hear casual games these days, they think of phone games, but actually back when I sort of started making games commercially, 2005, casual games meant downloadable games for PC and Mac. And there were specific types of games sold via casual distributors online. So you would tend to download a demo, play it for an hour, and if you liked it, then you would buy the game. So casual games are things like match 3 games, hidden object games, time management games, card games, puzzle games. And so actually when I started, I was making an arcade game called Iron Fist, which nothing to do with the Marvel franchise. It was like a multiple scrolling beat 'em up game. But I realized at the time it was going to take too long to finish and that there wasn't a decent market for it. Because this is before Steam, it's before Xbox Live indie games, before loads of decent ways to sell your game. And at the time I played Bejeweled and I thought that's pretty good. I can probably make my own sort of version of that and riff on the design and so on. And casual games were a market that was selling. So I didn't sort of make my dream project, but I did make a game that I thought had a viable market. And I enjoyed the whole process of getting my engine up and running and making that game and then getting it out there. Though admittedly, my first 2 games did not sell very well. And it wasn't really until the 3rd game that I began to hit my stride and make better money from the market. And that kept on going. So my niche is casual downloadable games mostly, except for Shadowhand, our last game, which we made specifically for the Steam audience. It's got certain casual trappings and feels about it, but it's got a lot more RPG elements, a bit more sort of hardcore gamer elements, and it was, as I say, designed for the Steam audience. So that's a different thing that we did, and it really the target market and demographic and platform you're aiming for should define what you're doing game design in your game design wise in your game, and artistic style and everything, your marketing, everything has to be carefully targeted. You can't just sort of make a random game and hope that the platform you're putting it on will like it.
Did you play like the latest games in your chosen genre and make a list of those and really research into what the best features were?
Yeah, that's actually definitely the way I work. So I download the best games. Back in the day, I was downloading the best match 3s. In fact, for many years, anytime a competitor came out with one, I would download it, look at it, see what was good about it, what wasn't good about it, and I made lists of what I felt made a good match 3 game, and I tried to incorporate those elements into mine. I later did the same with solitaire games before I made Fairway Solitaire for Big Fish Games, and then even later on, I did the same before Regency Solitaire. I also look at the chart positions of those games on the casual portals and just seeing how well they're doing and why. It's seeing almost like if I can predict beforehand if a game's good enough to go up the charts or not when it first comes out. Because if I can predict it, then I can emulate the things that I think it's doing right. So yeah, I was very much into sort of loose market analysis and playing the games to get the best ideas from them, really. Not necessarily to copy them, but just to make sure that mine had either sort of those important elements, or I could develop those elements further.
So you would find those elements and then look for something unique or something entertaining to add to that?
Yeah, especially as a lot of sort of the casual market is about retheming. So you've got the sort of mechanic, but then you retheme it. People call it reskinning. Now, the problem with reskinning, it sounds a bit too simplistic, like, oh, I just changed graphics. But when you retheme something, so like I made a spring game and then later on I rethemed it as a Halloween game. I basically went off and did all this kind of research about Halloween topics, horror topics, you know, movies, books, general sort of tropes, and filtered that down to what I thought was the best list of things that fully represented Halloween. And then I put those things into the game as like power-ups and special objects in the game and shapes and part of the meta game. So the theme, you know, informed the design as a result. It wasn't just some kind of basic reskin. And that's what I like to do with each of my games, let the theme become a design pillar which affects all the decisions that I make from that point. But I'm still using a sort of core mechanic which we know works and people like.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's, I suppose that core mechanic is the bread and butter. You have to tap into that audience. You said that it was your third game when you really hit your stride. What did you learn from the first two? What were the tweaks that you made that allowed for the success of the third one?
Well, the first two games, well, certainly the first one, it didn't look very good. Okay, so it had cheap looking art. I mean, there was stock art in there, stock photographs and things, stock music. So the whole thing, I guess it lacked coherency. I actually think it plays well. People still think it plays well because I think I nailed the kind of gameplay. But in terms of people, especially, okay, when you've got a demo model where you play a demo and then you're going to pay after that, people want to pay for something that they feel is worth the money, right? So they're getting value from it. And if it looks great and sounds great and plays well, they're going to convert. But if it doesn't look great, it doesn't feel valuable, it feels cheap, they're not going to want to spend the money on it. So for the third game, I actually worked with a producer in the States, and he hired a couple of artists and a musician and paid them some decent money to make all the graphics and music. And so the thing just felt way more professional, higher level of quality. So even though the mechanics were kind of the same, we added some new ones. It was just the overall quality. Also, I switched engines and I was able to start doing basic stuff like scaling and rotation and transparency. So I was able to put really nice particle effects in the game, which I didn't have before. And that extra level of bling adds something to this kind of casual experience. So, you know, so it was that really. It was just a step up in the quality, but that was achieved by spending money on professionals.
Was that a passion project for you? Is that now out of your system and you'll sort of return to the smaller, more casual games again? What are you up to at the moment?
Shadow Hand was a prequel to Regency Solitaire. So in 2013, my wife came up with an idea to do a Jane Austen themed card game for the casual market, and we did that. It did very well there. We put it on Steam as a sort of afterthought, and it's done okay there. But the idea with Shadowhand was to basically make a prequel for that, but add in all these extra RPG elements and kind of cool stuff. It was supposed to be a proper, not so much a passion project. It was supposed to be a commercial project, but it was something we were passionate in doing as well. So it's like a both combination, right? That the problem, I guess, with that game is that, and I know this for sure, it took too long to make, okay? And that's because I overscoped it. It had so much content and so much detail that all of that took a long time to refine and get right and polish. So the game took too long really to be commercially viable, and it ends up looking like a passion project, but really it was a sort of overscoped, you know, commercial project that we were passionate about. But yes, what are we doing now is we're actually making a different version of Shadowhand for the casual portals. The reason is, as it stands, if we try and put it on the casual distribution sites, a lot of the players won't like all the RPG elements, the sort of more complex elements, and the dueling. So we're actually taking that out and going back to just a core story with the main character and everything else, and just plain levels to play through, but still with all the various cool mechanics and upgrades and power-ups you can get just with the combat taken out, which sounds weird, but it will actually work very well, we think, for that market and could generate a whole load of extra revenue separate from the Steam revenue. So that's why we're doing that. That won't take very long. That's a sort of a small, no-brainer project that doesn't cost any third-party money, just my time and my wife's time to help with the design. And then we've got this is sort of news. We've got a sequel lined up for Regency Solitaire. So Regency Solitaire 2.
Oh, fantastic.
You know, there's enough fans out there of the original that we want to do that, and it can be done a lot quicker because I don't need to code the whole engine again. We just need to put the new story in, the new metagame, obviously new art and stuff like that. But it's a lot quicker than coding all that from scratch because I'm a big fan of reusing your engine where possible to make more games. So those are two things in the very near future, and I've got sort of other longer term plans. But yes, shorter games to get me back basically on track with making an income so that I can survive, because Shadowhand, great as we think it is done okay, but you know, it just took too long, and I need to make shorter games and more money sooner.
Absolutely. I think out of the 65 games I've made, like only 10 of them have actually been, you know, what I would call a hit, and only another sort of 20 or 30 would have washed their face, you know.
Right.
Otherwise they've cost me money or just, you know, about scrape by.
Right.
You talk often about the long tail of your games, and you've seen them perform over the years. What is the money-making life cycle of your games, and how do you refresh them? Do you still like tie them into time-based events, or use your relationships to refresh the offering?
I think things are changing anyway. So what I did in the past might not be as repeatable now. But what happened was when the games came out on the casual portals, these distributors like Big Fish, Gamehouse, iWin, and so on, I had, and I still have, a rep at all of them. So what I could do is a year later after it came out, I could contact the rep and say, hey, how about re-promoting my game again? Perhaps Regency Solitaire, you know, it would be re-promoted around Valentine Day or spring bonus in the spring, or obviously spooky bonus at Halloween, Christmas games at Christmas. So that was the advantage of having some seasonal games. I was able to go back to them and say, hey, you know, are you doing a seasonal sale? Please put my game in it. And because I had a human contact then, I'd met some of these people at things like Casual Connect or GDC in the States. And they would, you know, often oblige, and that would give the game an extra spike that year round, push it back into the sort of visible charts again, and so on. The other thing I did was I hadn't initially localized a bunch of my games, and I went back and localized them later to multiple languages, and that gave me an opportunity to get the portals to sort of put them on their non-English sites and make a bunch more money. I even did a thing with Holiday Bonus. I made a Holiday Bonus Gold version, which is the same game with more levels, a few tech enhancements so it ran better on newer systems, and you know, got some portals to take that as a new game or like a promoted update. So it was always often about maintaining a relationship with these sites and getting to re-promote my games. And some of my games have had a 10-year tail as a result. But if I brought out one of those games now, I'm not sure the casual sites would be around for 10 more years. It's changing a lot. So that's what I mean when I say it's not necessarily repeatable. But I do know that I know a lot of people who've got representatives, developer relations representatives at Steam, sorry, at Valve, you know, for their games on Steam. And they have been able to get very sweet sort of deals and promotions and stuff in the past. But many devs these days don't have a representative, and it's very hard to get one. And even so, you know, Valve have said that they're moving away from that model to more of a sort of general model when people don't get preferential treatment, but algorithms take over and decide which things to promote and so on. So it was definitely about maintaining relationships with those sites, doing some kinds of updates as well, you know, along the way. But to be honest, for most of those old games, I have now said, okay, that's it. I'm just focusing on the new ones now because they've had a good run, made me some good money, and they still make money every day now, but it's a small amount now.
These changes that you're talking about and the algorithmic changes on Steam, for example, are you doing anything to combat that or to understand that? I know you like to sort of research and track into what's going on. Um, are you doing anything yourself algorithmically to optimize for these changes?
Well, one of the things is to find out why Valve sort of promotes some games and not other ones, or you know what's going on behind their algorithms. And so what I do is I keep in touch with other developers who are interested in that very same thing, or who've had contact with Valve employees who tell them what they're doing. So at GDC recently, I went to a meeting with a bunch of devs, and somebody from Valve turned up, and we got to ask them a load of questions. You know, and they told us how certain things are working and so on. So first off, it's keeping your ear to the ground and reading the right articles, talking to the right people to see what's happening within Valve, and then optimizing your own strategy around that. And definitely some of the things I found out recently are that, well, we sort of always know this anyway, that marketing is very powerful, but on Steam, you can put your game up with a coming soon page, and you should just do that as early as possible with a nice video and some text about the game, and keep promoting that page in order to get wish lists. And also people on Steam can follow your game, because later on those wish lists and follows will convert on day one into sales. And obviously the more you've got, the more sales you're going to get on day one. And if you get a large enough amount of sales on day one, you'll go into the sort of featured new and trending list, which is good because then you're on the front page. And if you get it even more, you can maybe get a panel at the top, which you know is right on the front of Steam. So pretty useful. And then that can lead to future promotions further down the line. But there's no guarantees of any of this stuff. You just have to have got a decent game that's got enough wish lists up front. And actually that's a lot. I mean, a Valve employee recently told me you should aim for 50,000, which is a huge amount of wish lists. It was more than we had for Shadowhand, for sure. So yeah, that's it really. Keep my ear to the ground, figure things out. Ultimately, I've still got to try and make good games and still got to try and promote those games so that we have a solid launch. There are other strategies actually, like, it's a bit of a weird one, but I could sell the games direct on my own website first, but then my true fans would buy them there and not on Steam, thus deflating the launch, and they wouldn't leave reviews on Steam. And at the beginning, you want your true fans to leave positive reviews and help bolster the launch. That's if you're putting all your money into a Steam launch, but other people would maybe prefer to sell direct or via itch.io or other methods to try and break the monopoly, you know, the Valve has with Steam. But I don't think I'm big enough to sort of make a difference there at the moment. It would take all developers or a few huge developers to sort of make that change, really. So I have to go with the flow, which is make my Steam launch as big as possible.
Do you spend money on Steam yourself, marketing on games?
Well, we had a publisher for Shadowhand, and they did definitely spend money. That's Positech Games. Cliff Harris is one of the few indies who advocates spending money on adverts. So, you know, we did a site takeover on a particular site. He also spends money on Facebook ads, Reddit ads, I think, and a few other places, but he's got Facebook ads down pretty well. All of those were sort of to drive people to the site beforehand to get wish lists, and then on launch to keep traffic coming in, and paying streamers, which is a thing that some streamers do, or anything dodgy like, you know, buying fake reviews or something like that, you know.
Oh, goodness.
You know, all that sort of stuff. So we haven't done anything like that. But so I haven't personally spent the money, but the publisher has, in a sense. Oh, and we went to shows. You know, we did several shows in the UK, EGX and Rezzed and PC Gamer Weekender, in order to meet press and also get feedback from players about the game to improve the game.
I mean, you've been writing about launching games on Steam recently on Gamer Sutra. What are the key findings from the research that you've done?
So wish lists, if you have wish lists before you launch, each one ends up, you end up with about 0.5 sales per wish list in the first week. Okay, so they don't all come from the wish list. So you might have 10,000 wish lists and they convert at 20%, say. So you get just generally at launch, you'll get a whole load of organic sales come in, and they might be another 4,000. So you might end up with 5 or 6,000 sales. So wish lists correlate loosely, you know, at about 0.5. So you can say if my game's only got 100 wish lists before launch, it's not going to do very well. But that's indicative of your marketing ability as well as anything, really. So that was one thing. Then your first week of sales, if you multiply that by about 4.5, 5, that will end up being your first year of sales. Okay. Now the range was more like 2 times to 10 times, but that's really useful because if you've just launched your game and it's made $10,000 in the first week, you can say, well, it's probably going to make about 50,000 in the first year. Worst case 20,000, best case 100,000. That's not a lot of money if you're making a game. You know, you spend a year on it, especially if you've got a team. But you can then use that to budget, you know, or look at your cash flow basically for the forthcoming year, rather than being in some sort of illusion that, well, it only did 10,000 the first week, but surely it's going to do 52 times that in a year. You know, that's not going to happen. It's going to be more like 5 with regular sales and so on. And then another piece of information I found out was to do with there used to be a site called Steam Spy. Well, it's still there, where you could look up games on Steam, and they had scraped the players' data to see, okay, this game has got 10,000 owners, and from that you could roughly calculate the revenue the game had made. But Valve changed their privacy policy recently, and they've hid all the sort of player games by default. So Steam Spy hasn't been able to show that information. So I went back to an older method, which was looking at the number of reviews and multiplying them by something to work out how many units were sold. And it turns out from all this data I collected, it's about times 64. So if a game's got 100 reviews, it's got, what, 6,400 unit sales. Now that number can vary. It can be as low as times 30. And that happens for sort of story adventure-y games that are quite short, that players play and feel connected to and leave a review. And for more sort of sim or roguelike games or RPGs, it's more like 100 times or over. But it still gives you a ballpark. And that's often all you really need to know. If you look at a game and it's got 10 reviews, you know that unfortunately it's not done great. But if it's got 1,000, well, they're doing pretty well. You can use that to approximate units sold and revenue. Though you know that's only maximum revenue, because you've got things like discounts would reduce that revenue. So those are some key things I found out recently, but it's all about Steam because that's the kind of market I'm interested in, and it's to help developers be realistic about what they can expect, so they don't have this sort of grand hopes of spending 3 years on a game, you know, releasing it and making millions, because that's the sort of success story you hear about, but it isn't the reality for most devs. And I'm very worried about people betting their sort of savings or house or sanity on a game and having it fail. So that was the reason behind me doing all this stuff.
Yeah, thank you. I got the opportunity to read some of it.
Hi, I am utterly delighted to welcome David Wenk. I'll keep holding.
We have prepared nothing, except everything.
So I'm an archaeologist, and I just want to thank the organizers of this for inviting an archaeologist to talk about these kinds of quite fundamental issues about politics. And I'm not going to bore you, as archaeologists often like to do, with pictures of 30,000-year-old royal-looking burials or magnificent stone temples from before the Neolithic period.
Much though they are cool.
Yeah, but we'd rather try and attempt something like a dialogue, because in a way, that is what we propose to talk about, is the importance of dialogue in human history.
Yeah, well, okay. And we chose to call our paper about the myth of the stupid savage because, well, this came out of our work on Rousseau. We were originally going to write a book on the origins of social inequality. And the more we started researching the topic, the more we realized that this is kind of a weird question to even be asking. First of all, it assumes a sort of primordial state of innocence, and that inequality, sort of comes out of that. And the reason why we started is because we realized that essentially for the last 200-300 years, people have just been giving variations on the same narrative as Rousseau over and over and over again. And it never seems to go away. So we wanted to create an alternative narrative. But finally, why was he asking this question to begin with? The interesting thing about Rousseau was that he was actually writing the famous essay on the origin of social inequality for a contest, for the best essay on the origins of social inequality. It was put out by the Académie Dijon in, I believe, 1751 or 2.
It must be slightly earlier, because the discourse is 1754, so...
The contest was the year before, yeah.
Yeah, so
something like that. Yeah. But basically the joke was he didn't win. And I actually managed to get a hold of all the other essays that were submitted. There's one book where you can find out. And it was hotly contested. Many of the arguments that you see nowadays were already being bounced around in 1751. And the thing which fascinated me when I started reading this is, okay, Ancien Regime France. Here we have a society where presumably, no one had ever walked into a room where they didn't know exactly where everybody ranked in relation to each other. It's one of the most hierarchical and elaborately hierarchical societies. And, here they're doing essay contests, which just assume that everybody starts from the question of there was primordial equality and something changed. What was it? So we started a process of asking how that came about. And what we discovered was, I don't want to cut completely to the end, but what we discovered is that what Rousseau really introduced was not the idea of the noble savage, which is kind of a dubious concept at all. It was really introduced by very conservative, explicitly racist thinkers, actually, in the 19th century as a way of for making fun of the sort of people who we now had attitudes which were typical of cultural anthropologists, who were somewhat relativistic, or said that non-Western cultures really had any value at all. It wasn't the idea of the noble savage, or there are people out there who have something to teach us. That was very much assumed in the discourse he came out of. But the idea that they had something to teach us because of what they didn't know, that they were somehow innocent creatures who, Rousseau even argued that people in a state of nature have no imagination. They have no sense of history. They can't project themselves into the future. Their happiness is based on their complete simple-mindedness. And that was actually a new idea. That wasn't in the previous discourse, as we'll see. So, and that in turn made me reflect on the very idea of political self-consciousness. And I thought I would start by talking a little bit about that. We are have a notion that somehow what makes humans humans is the fact that we are self-conscious, that we can fully conscious beings that can reflect on the nature of our reality and our situation, and that has both a individual and a social manifestation. So, if you go back to Cartesian dualism, thought or self-reflection is the definition of what makes us sentient beings different from animals. And that notion of self-consciousness is simultaneously reflected in the idea that society itself can and should at least ultimately become self-conscious. The ideal of social evolution was seen as getting us to a point of self-consciousness, whether in the philosophical sense in Hegel, where all history leads up to the point where you can have someone like Hegel reflecting on the nature of history, or the idea that self-consciousness is embodied in actual control over the conditions of your existence, and Marx and other socialist thinkers. So it's actually a very interesting notion, because you have people, for example, arguing that ancient Greeks and Homer weren't actually conscious at all. The bicameral mind guy in this argument. There are people, and so somehow our consciousness or self-consciousness advances over time. But which is actually quite odd, if you the idea that human beings are self-conscious and that's the definition, or that we are more so. Neuroscientists actually say that self-consciousness tends to last about 7 seconds in human beings, a sort of window of consciousness when you're consciously reflecting on, you're aware that you exist. Basically, we're on autopilot almost all the time and might as well be asleep. That's why people can do these kind of forms of elaborate sleepwalking where they get into cars and drive off 200 miles and suddenly say, where am I? Because you might as well be asleep when you're doing most of that stuff anyway.
But there's an exception to that.
Yes, indeed. There is an exception to that, which is largely when you're talking to someone else. So in conversation and dialogue, you actually can maintain consciousness for very long periods of time, which is why you need to imagine you're talking to someone else to really be able to think out a problem. So actually consciousness is a social phenomenon, it's dialogic. So rather than, self-consciousness being this incredible achievement that we eventually have, most ancient philosophers, for example, assume that. They start with dialogues. Almost all ancient philosophy, whether it's in China, India, or Europe, takes the form of conversations. But they're conversations about thinking about how you can become a self-conscious individual, which is the kind of person Descartes sort of assumes that we start as, even though we're not. However, so social consciousness in most of the world's history has assumed your starting point, an individual consciousness, something you maybe will someday achieve. Instead, we flip that over, and nowadays we seem to have this idea that the very idea that we can imagine and create a society is something new. That it's something that takes huge amounts of historical evolution to get to, and
that's, in a way, I think, one of the... we should probably say we came at these kind of rather general issues through some very specific parts of evidence, because as David was pointing out, we initially set out about, 6 or 7 years ago, to contribute to this burgeoning literature on the topic of inequality and the origins of inequality. And it was in the process of actually thinking about what kind of contribution we would make as an archaeologist and an anthropologist, that we just began to realize how peculiar the starting point of the question really is, insofar as it assumes that there was something else in order for a social inequality to have an origin. So in looking back at the origins of the question, what we found were a number of interesting things that we would want to talk about today. But it might be helpful to follow, or maybe for me to follow, some of those sort of trains of thought initially, which really are about this issue of what you might call self-conscious political behavior, of their own political arrangements. Now, there's a sort of paradox here, because if you read evolutionary biologists and evolutionary theorists like Christopher Böhm, whose book Hierarchy in the Forest, he's a primatologist, is quite explicit about this and says, well, this is precisely what makes human politics different from the politics of, say, chimpanzees or bonobos or orangutans, is what he calls our actuarial intelligence, which I believe what he means by this is the fact that we can, in fact, imagine what another kind of society might be like. So imagine a group of hunters and gatherers who can picture what might, in fact, transpire if they didn't make fun of the very skilled hunter who brought down the ideal catch that day, or if they didn't share out the meat and other resources from the hunt in an equal sort of way, without prejudice towards those who actually engaged in it. They can sort of imagine what kind of society they might be living in if they didn't make fun of exceptionally talented individuals. And therefore, they build their own society on the basis partly of imagination. But there is a paradox here, and the paradox is that when he and other writers actually talk about what happened in human history, it's almost as if they don't want to explore the implications of their own hypothesis, because what he writes quite explicitly is that for most of human history, at least in political terms, nothing really happened. People lived in these small egalitarian bands of foragers, hunters, foresters, and gatherers for 100,000 plus years. Then there was the origins of agriculture, and then came the 6, 7, or 8, however many great civilizations with their alpha male pharaohs and kings and leaders. As we all know, this is effectively the story in outline that Rousseau was telling 250 or so years ago. Now, to me as an archaeologist, this is very interesting. Would it not be very bizarre and fascinating if all the efforts of me and all my archaeological colleagues to actually dig down into the traces of what humans have got up to just happened to conform perfectly to what some Swiss philosopher imagined might have been the case in 1754. Wouldn't that be an extraordinary coincidence? And in fact, that is roughly the sort of consensus. When you read sort of big history type books, it's very much the impression you get. It's also, we're quite convinced, wrong to say this in almost every respect. And a lot of what we've been doing for the last few years is quite sort of detailed empirical work, actually looking at what the evidence tells us now. Now, and other ways to conceptualize it.
Because it's very easy to say it's all wrong. You could do that in about 20 pages. But if you want to say what actually happened, it's an enormous amount of work, because essentially it's not just that people don't write for people outside their specialties, they don't write for people outside their subspecialties.
That's right.
An enormous work of synthesis that just nobody's been doing.